Hi, Zoom people. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here at the super early panel. I'm not a morning person, so yeah. Okay, so I am a pretty newly minted associate teaching professor of English at Penn State University. Thank you. I was, yes. I get to start using the title associate from December, but I don't get the pay until July. So, my PhD is in English from West Virginia University. Primarily, my work is about adaptations, contemporary theatrical adaptations of Greek drama and myth. I have a broad range of critical interests. My first book was published by Routledge in 2022. It's called Hellenic Common. My essays have appeared in PMLA, modern drama, contemporary drama, comparative drama, Limina, and elsewhere. I've memorized my bio, as you can probably tell. Yeah, so my paper is entitled Clytemnestra's Diary, Adapting Clytemnestra in Terry Deary's Groovy Greeks. And I feel like I'm kind of the odd one out in terms of like this series of panels, because as far as I can tell, I may be the only person who's focusing primarily on a male written text, but that's actually important and it matters, and I promise you that. So we'll talk about that. So, as a history nerd who grew up in the 1990s and early 2000s, I was obsessed with Terry Deary's Horrible Histories series. I had maybe 5 of the books, and I read them repeatedly. There's an incredible power in Deary's approach to teaching history in ways that children find interesting and engaging, especially by promising to reveal, as the introduction to Groovy Greeks puts it, all the things that teacher doesn't tell you, the things you really want to know, the hilarious stories and the horror stories. The combination of the gory, gruesome, and often hilariously absurd details of history matched with the rhetorical promise of peeling back the curtain to reveal secrets adults don't want kids to know is a potent combination. This rhetorical stance partly explains the series' success. In its roughly 32 years, Horrible Histories has blossomed from 2 initial books into over 23 main titles, a dozen special books, multiple TV series, movies, stage plays, video games, and merch. With massive engagement among children and adults like me who grew up on Horrible Histories, I'm now actually doing a whole YouTube series where I'm going through the main Horrible Histories books and doing videos about them. That's how much of a nerd I am. The franchise is an incredibly influential introduction to history and helps shape popular understandings of the past by influencing developing minds. It's precisely because of this pedagogical role that I'm looking today at Deary's Groovy Greeks, published in 1996, which was one of the books that I read endlessly as a child. In Groovy Greeks, Deary writes Diary of a Murder, which retells Aeschylus's Agamemnon from Clytemnestra's perspective. Deary's purpose across the Horrible Histories series is not an overtly feminist one, though girls have always featured as history students in the books, and most books feature sections on women's roles at that time. And he does not portray Clytemnestra without fault, but the very act of adapting the Agamemnon story from the perspective of the wronged wife and eventual murderer of a Greek hero is significant in that it foregrounds her motivations and explains why she plots revenge for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. Deary presents a more sympathetic, understanding portrait of Clytemnestra than we get in the Aeschylus merely by writing from her perspective. However, more significant than the compassionate depiction of Clytemnestra is the fact of it appearing in a children's book, particularly a series more likely on average to appeal to boys than girls. For a series famous for its focus on the gruesome, the gory, and the gross, to foreground Clytemnestra's experiences impacts how developing readers or thinkers are likely to engage with history and myth, because it models thinking about stories from the perspective of those otherwise silenced. In this sense, Deary's treatment of Clytemnestra generates new, more sympathetic reading strategies, opening doors for the reassessment of Clytemnestra's story. Probably the best-known depiction of Clytemnestra today is in Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy, which was first staged in 458 BCE, and is the only complete trilogy surviving from classical Athenian drama. Her story is also touched on in Homer's epics, Apollodorus' library, and elsewhere, and both Sophocles and Euripides have plays on events in the Orestes cycle. But Aeschylus's Oresteia is the most complete extant dramatic depiction of the action, recounting from Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia at the onset of the Trojan War, events discussed in the opening epode of the Agamemnon, through to Orestes' trial, in which Athena establishes the Athenian democratic jury system in the Eumenides. In Aeschylus, Clytemnestra appears in the Agamemnon and the Libation Bearers, the first two plays of the trilogy, playing a more prominent role in the opening play. For the 10 years of the Trojan War, Clytemnestra has nurtured her rage against her husband Agamemnon for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia, who in some variations of the myth survives when Artemis substitutes a deer as the blade is falling. And of course, if we sort of read Aeschylus's version with that awareness, Clytemnestra becomes even more villainous, right? Because if Iphigenia has not died, then her anger at Iphigenia's death is entirely foundationless. But in Aeschylus, it does seem pretty clear that Iphigenia has died. So, fair play to Clytemnestra, I guess. So the Agamemnon opens with the lighting of signal fires marking the Greek victory at Troy, and when Agamemnon returns to Mycenae, Clytemnestra convinces him to sacrilegiously walk over holy tapestries as he enters the house. Then, when Agamemnon is in his bath, Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus murder him and Cassandra, the Trojan princess and prophetess whom the Mycenaean king has taken as a sex slave. Interestingly enough, also a character basically denied voice. So that's a really interesting link with a lot of the other papers in these panels. We can talk more about that. In explaining her actions to the chorus, and I don't use the word justifying or defending because Clytemnestra believes she needs no defense or justification, the queen points to Agamemnon's violence against Iphigenia and highlights the double standard through which the Mycenaeans blame her for Agamemnon's death, but honor him for sacrificing their daughter. As she quite eloquently puts it, "So now you'd have me banished from my city, cursed ringingly and hated publicly? But before, against him lying there, you never spoke a thing. Yet he is the man who made a victim, as if she were a beast, as if he had no fleecy folds to sacrifice, of his own daughter, dear lamb of my womb, to charm the winds from Thrace. Why was he not hustled from the land, a filthy scapegoat? Instead, you turn your eyes on what I've done, rivet me with judgment." For as much as Clytemnestra's argument makes sense within a traditional system of revenge and reciprocal violence that starts the Oresteia trilogy, the chorus nonetheless rejects her assertion of justice, calling her, "You manslaughter-maddened mind with murder written on your face." Try saying that 10 times fast. Especially taken in conjunction with the libation bearers, in which Clytemnestra and Aegisthus rule as tyrants, oppressing and dispossessing Electra, and plotting the death of the exiled Orestes, it's clear that Aeschylus has a generally unfavorable view of Clytemnestra. Now, Deary's Diary of a Murder comes in the chapter Petrifying Plays and Electrifying Epics, about Greek epic poetry and the emergence of theater in 5th century BCE Athens. He specifically frames the story as Clytemnestra's diary, which is a common storytelling technique in horrible histories based on events in Aeschylus. In Deary's characterization, Clytemnestra is more relatable, psychologically rounded, and I would argue complex than she is in Aeschylus, in part because Deary's writing follows modern traditions rooted in psychological character development through prose, rather than the dramatic conventions in which character development occurs only through dialogue. The interiority of the diary allows psychological complexity, and for us to see Clytemnestra's motivations and thought process from her own perspective. For instance, the Mycenaean queen's relationship to her family members is realistically contradictory. She repeatedly insults her sister Helen, criticizing the decision to run off with Paris that launches the Trojan War, and yet, when Agamemnon demands to know if Clytemnestra has heard about Helen running off, She compliments Paris to spite her husband. As she explains in the diary, I knew that would upset him. Turned redder than blood on the sacrificial altar. I won't have him saying anything against our Helen. She's always been flighty, I don't mind saying it, but she's my sister and I won't have anyone else saying a word against her. Similarly, Clytemnestra's attitude toward her children reflects a dynamic perspective, though one aligned with the overarching movement of the Oresteia. She clearly dotes on Iphigenia, but refers to Electra and Orestes as the funny couple. And I'm fascinated by that. I like the ages of Electra and Orestes have never, ever, ever made sense to me. And I think that's just something we have to escape. But Deary sort of presents them as roughly the same age. Though that's clearly not the case in the Oresteia. I can't deal with that question at the moment. Clytemnestra's attitudes toward her family show her to be a complex and relatable character, someone familiar in daily life, and the kind of person that readers might well encounter in her complexity. And it matters that Deary creates a well-rounded depiction of Clytemnestra because she becomes relatable, more relatable than Aeschylus's Clytemnestra, whose complexity can only be developed through orature rather than access to her inner monologue. And this relatability creates sympathy, which is especially significant because of who Deary's typical reader likely is. And in the remainder of this presentation, I want to take that argument through in stages. So first, depicting the story from Clytemnestra's perspective builds sympathy by foregrounding her psychology, views, emotions, and reactions. This is done through what Jeremy Rosen calls minor character elaboration, which he describes as a genre of reclamation that involves constructing narratives around the perspectives of socially marginal figures in canonical works, often seeking to critique the ideologies underlying the manner in which those works represent minor characters or their failure to represent socially marginal figures at all. Texts like Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea, John Gardner's Grendel, or Tom Stoppart's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead are among the best-known works of minor character elaboration, although a lot of the stuff that's been talked about on these panels definitely falls into that category. But these texts, Rhys, Gardner, and Stoppard, foreground characters on the peripheries of or villainized within Jane Eyre, Beowulf, and Hamlet, respectively. Minor character elaboration is commonly used in feminist, post-colonial, and LGBT reworkings of classics, and Deary does the same thing by presenting Clytemnestra's perspective of her own experiences and motivations, rather than aligning with Aeschylus's condemnation of the Mycenaean queen. Rosen does, quite accurately, point out problems with the idea of giving voice to a marginalized person when the actual words are those of a modern author with varying degrees of privilege. Deary is, after all, a straight white man from the global north. And actually, I think this is another interesting thing that we could talk about, this sort of question of giving voice to characters when clearly it is not that character speaking, it is still an author putting words in their mouth, but is that meaningful for a fictional character? Q&A time. But even with this important caveat in mind, minor character elaboration serves an important rhetorical function as a form of adaptation by drawing attention to the ways in which certain characters are depicted within canonical works and opening possibilities for how they might otherwise be portrayed. Generally, works of minor character elaboration do generate sympathy in readers, if for no other reason than that we tend to sympathize with complex characters whose inner lives we encounter. And this shifting of perspective is important as a form of adaptation because it helps, as Rosen puts it, critique the ideologies underlying the manner in which those works represent minor characters. While casual observers are likely to think of adaptation as a linear process in which an older source text is reworked later on, the reality is more complicated. As Linda Hutchin argues in her field defining a theory of adaptation, experiencing an adaptation that we know is an adaptation alters the way we then understand the source text. She writes, "If we know the works in question, we become a knowing audience, and part of what hermeneutic theory calls our horizon of expectation involves that adapted text. What is intriguing is that afterward we often come to see the prior adapted work very differently as we compare it to the result of the adapter's creative and interpretive act. In an argument inflected by reader response theory, Hutchin is, in other words, arguing that encountering an adaptation changes how audiences understand the source text precisely because the adaptation draws our attention to some critical component of the original. This is definitely true of minor character elaboration, in which the experiences of otherwise suppressed characters are brought to the forefront. And Deary announces Diary of a Murder as a kind of adaptation of the Oresteia, even though he doesn't use the word adaptation specifically. He introduces the diary by explaining, playwright Aeschylus didn't write about the fighting at Troy. Homer's poem did that. Aeschylus looked at the story of the women left behind. Women like Clytemnestra, wife of the Greek leader Agamemnon. If Clytemnestra had kept a diary of those exciting years, would it have looked something like this? ... Deary does therefore directly announce the link between the diary and Aeschylus's trilogy, ensuring that his readers can be a knowing audience, in Hutchin's words. However, the extent to which readers can really be a knowing audience is likely limited by the genre of Groovy Greeks, children's literature. I'm working from some broad assumptions here, and please feel free to disagree during the Q&A, but I suspect that the primary reading audience of Horrible Histories are pre- or early adolescent boys. And this comes with a couple of important implications. One is that the majority of Deary's readers most likely haven't read or seen the Oresteia. This means that they are not truly a knowing audience in the sense that Hutchin means, because readers unfamiliar with Aeschylus do not bring the condemnation Aeschylus builds into the play to his diary. To the diary that Deary writes. Sorry, not Aeschylus's diary, which I realized just now was what was implied there. Although that would be cool. Their view of Clytemnestra is probably closer to a blank slate. Ironically, this means that from a reader response perspective, Deary's text may color their first encounters with Aeschylus proper when or if they read or see the Oresteia. They may be less likely to accept uncritically the Aeschylean presentation of Clytemnestra as villain. For an audience of boys in particular, this may do important ideological work toward countering toxic masculinity. Much classic literature, as you all know, contains unflattering, problematic, or anti-feminist depictions of women, and I would put the Oresteia's portrayal of Clytemnestra squarely in that category. However, if readers or viewers come to the Oresteia primed to see Clytemnestra as a complex and relatable figure worthy of empathy, then readers or viewers are less likely to accept Aeschylus's depiction without questioning socio-cultural assumptions that underpin it. Even if this was not his direct goal, Deary's sympathetic portrayal of Clytemnestra could help train young men to see women in literature as genuine human beings, often repressed within their cultural contexts, and to question the ways these literary works normalize such repression. Thank you.